Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today at this first CERA event at Labour Connected, and the first to kick off our 4-event programme. I'm Jake Sumner, one of the CERA co-chairs of CERA and chair of the session today. This event is our CERA COP26 question time, which we're holding with the Sustainability Hub, and thank you to the SUS Hub for supporting this event. CERA is Labour's environment campaign. For those of you who don't know, we're Labour's environment voice. We're a socialist society, and independent of, but affiliated to the Labour Party. And we work with Labour political representatives, MPs, mayors, first ministers, councillors, NGOs and businesses to create a platform for and push ambitious climate and environment policy. So please join if you aren't a member, and details are on our website. On the format today, I'll introduce our speakers shortly and then begin with a few questions, and then get your questions ready because this is a question time and we'll try and get as many in as we can. And please do so in the Q&A function and leave the chat box for any links people might want to post. We won't be able to bring people in and out for the questions, and I'll put them to the panelists, so I'll be doing that. The session is about 50 minutes and Mark has to leave after about half an hour, and we're going to have to, we're looking to close around 11:50. Please tweet hashtag CERA COP26 and hashtag Labour Connected. We are also recording this event and we'll put it on our website afterwards for those who can't join now, and we've already had considerable interest in this. Normally at Labour conference, we'd be in a packed room. There might even have been a dash to the venue for one of our speakers, but now we're glued to our screens. The advantage is that anyone across the country can now see our events who might not have been able to make Liverpool where we were due to be. And we can also get guests from far and wide. And one of those today is Dr. Duncan Webber, an MP from New Zealand. He might not have had the trip here, but I think it is 11 PM there. So thank you so much for joining so late. And just to run very briefly through our guests today, we've got Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales. He became a member of the Senedd in May 2011. He's held various briefs: Health and Social Services, Cabinet Secretary of Finance, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, we've just said, and then the First Minister for Wales. He's been leading on the COVID response in Wales, and we've seen Mark regularly on our screens. Thank you once again for joining today and everything you're doing in this difficult time. And Wales has an ambitious environment programme, which we'll look at in this session. Darren Jones is the Labour MP for Bristol North West and chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee. Darren also runs Labour Digital, a centre-left think tank looking at AI, and also chairs the Institute of AI, which is a global network of legislators looking at regulation of it. And the committee, as we'll look at later, has got an inquiry into COP26. Duncan Webb is an MP from New Zealand and chair of the Environment Select Committee. There, he sits on Finance and Expenditure Committee 2 and the Regulations Review Committee. He's had critical roles in the patches of climate change legislation, resource management reforms, and most recently, the COVID response. Dr. Rebecca Wills is a researcher with 20 years experience in environment and sustainability. She's a professor in practice at Lancaster Environment Centre and an expert for the Climate Assembly UK, an expert lead for the Climate Assembly UK, the National Citizens Assembly commissioned by Parliament, and she's had various advisory roles and founded the Green Alliance's Climate Leadership Programme to support MPs. And Karen Potter is the project director for the SUS Hub with nearly 2 decades of experience and climate action campaigning on energy and demand reduction. She co-founded and manages the Secretariat for the Net Zero APPG, which is chaired by one of our MPs and part of the executive of CERA, Alex Sobel. And she's a climate change ambassador for Idea X Me, I think I pronounced that right, a global podcast and mentor program, and co-founder of the Global Food Awards and Summit. So that's our panelists. Thank you very much for them coming. And so I was just going to turn to Darren first of all and say, look, very briefly, you've got this study, your inquiry of the Select Committee. Can you sort of say where you think the UK is and where the climate talks are and where we need to be in a very strategic and short way to get us off?
Well, thanks, Jake, for the invitation. It's great to be with you and with such a great panel of speakers today at this important event. The Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee in the House of Commons holds the department to account, and as you're colleagues will know Alok Sharma, the Secretary of State, is also the COP26 president here in Westminster. And so my committee, therefore, kind of leads the accountability of government on this particular issue. It's perhaps obvious to say that we've got an extra year now to prepare because, of course, COP26 was supposed to be at the end of this calendar year, but for obvious reasons has been pushed back to the end of the next calendar year. And on that basis, we've not actually seen a huge amount of detail come out of the department yet about what it wants to achieve by co-presiding over COP26, of course, with our friends in Italy. So my committee has launched a campaign, an inquiry on this issue. We're going to be kicking off some evidence sessions on this in November. The first immediate challenge, in my view, is publication of Britain's domestic contribution, the figure that we put forward along with every other country in advance of COP, which says how much we anticipate to decarbonise our economy here, which we are due to do at the end of this calendar year. There has been some concern from stakeholders that we might not do that in December when we were anticipated to do so. And of course, those of us that think Britain needs to provide global leadership, it needs to provide domestic leadership in order to do so, will want a kind of big progressive number around those decarbonisation targets. And we know from the Committee on Climate Change that we're starting to fall behind as a country on our carbon budgets. We were pretty good internationally in the first few carbon budgets, especially on decarbonising power, but we've started to fall behind, and we're expecting the next report from the Committee on Climate Change in terms of the 6th carbon budget to conclude that we really haven't made as much progress as we want to. So I think there's a big challenge for the government to say, at home here in Britain, we're going to aim for a big number on decarbonising, and this is how we're going to get to it. And there were some reports in the paper this weekend that the Prime Minister is due to give a keynote speech on what he sees from the green recovery. So I hope that we'll see it in that. But as a consequence, we can then go into COP26 saying, look, we've made some great progress on these issues. We're going to make some progress on other issues. And we think by working together, we can make the distance internationally. Because at the moment, we've already seen the impacts of I think it's a degree above pre-industrial levels, with the forest fires in the United States, floods in Bangladesh, Pakistan. We had the fires in Australia not long ago. So people are living now with the consequences of climate change. And this conference really, in my view, has to be very, very ambitious in saying, look, we need to pick up the pace because we're already falling behind and we're already living with the consequences. And now is the time to set that out. So I hope that we'll achieve that.
Yeah, I'll just pause you. Yeah, thank you for that, Darren. I think that's an excellent overview. And Rebecca, and I'll come to Karen in a sec. Do you want to add to that, and sort of from your work you've been doing, the research perspective on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would absolutely echo Darren's comments that this is a combination of a diplomatic challenge and also a domestic policy challenge if we're going to lead the way for COP26. I mean, let me just set out 3 priorities, which I'm sure we'll go on to discuss. I think the first is that we need a laser-like focus on the near term as well as 2050. You know, often discussion gets pushed out to what we need to do over the next 30 years. I think we're actually talking about 3 months and 3 years instead, particularly because of the urgent need to align with COVID recovery. So first priority is think of the near term. I think the second, and actually one where Wales has led the way, is on not just promoting low carbon, but also thinking about how we bring an orderly end to high carbon industries and how we support people in jobs and transitions on that. And thirdly, there's a critical challenge around public engagement. And I was so pleased to see Parliament sponsoring the Climate Assembly process, which brought together a representative group of citizens from across the country. Their number 1 priority was public engagement and government and citizens working together on this. So for me, those are the 3 things that are absolutely essential to success at COP26, not just for the UK, but for other countries as well.
And before I come to Mark, then, Ruth, do you want to sort of add to that? And I think there's a series of asks that you've been putting together.
Right, thanks, Jake. Yes, we're working with the Net Zero APPG, and we've been doing a series of what we're calling sort of streams that are looking at the big picture items. How are we going to push government? What are those key items that we need to be focused on? And as Rebecca says, we're really looking at those short-term things that need to happen right now. And we all know that the things that are the easy things to do, like energy efficiency and perhaps some of the first stages of decarbonizing our transport grid, those are the things that will come to us, that we have solutions for, we know how to achieve at scale. It's when we get deeper and deeper and further in, it's going to be much, much more difficult to do. So the findings of the Net Zero APBG have been really, and again, this is all going to be a lot of violent agreement, I think, but to echo what Darren has been saying and Rebecca's been saying, we need to make these first incremental changes, and we need to establish, it really does need to start with leadership, because we have seen, for as long as I've been campaigning, nearly 2 decades, we have seen every government failed to do this and failed to lead. I'll say years ago, nearly 20 years ago, there was a potential low carbon transition plan, and there was a zero carbon housing plan. All of that stuff we saw has been abolished over time. So what we need to do is we need to start from the top. And this is just like any business where you need your entire C-suite to support this. You need to have number 10 driving this. You need Treasury behind this. You need BEIS, and you need all the key departments, DEFRA, to support this. What we need is a very, I would say, a clear, concise, and a long-term strategy, how we're going to pay for this, and a time scale, and when this is going to be done. We see that the remaining challenge, once we get past that first bit, is going to be very, very difficult. So let's get on the road right now, do those things we need to do. We need energy efficiency. We need to deal with the homes. We need to look at, in terms of looking at the builds and how homes are being built today, because we know that they're not achieving the level we need. So we continue to build to a level that is not even going to be suitable going forward. So we really need to address those problems that are on that easy to reach, those problems that we have, those scalable solutions right now. And that leadership needs to start with number 10, and it needs to start with Treasury. And then we can go and we can start to build the momentum from there. But following on the climate
I'll just pause you there, Karen. I'll just pause you there, because I think that point is a useful one. As CERA, we've called for a whole government approach as well. We've also called for all expenditure to be viewed through a carbon lens, so we can direct us on net zero. And actually, I want to bring in Mark. Mark is here. Mark Drakeford. He runs. He's the First Minister of Wales. Runs Wales. Mark, what have you been doing in Wales? How important is leadership from the top on this? What more support do you need from the UK government? And how do we move forward? You're the most prominent Labour representative in office, I think, in the UK. So over to you, Mark.
Well, Jake, thank you. The starting point is, for us in Wales, is that everything we do as a government comes under the umbrella of our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So that is an act that requires every action that government takes to be judged not simply against its impact in the here and now, but on what it means for those who come after us. So that is a major driver of the way we make policy in all areas in the Welsh Government, and it sits absolutely across what we do in relation to environmental policy and the preparations we are making for COP26 as well. And 3 very brief points, if I could. Our approach to COP26 is to try to develop a distributed leadership in Wales. Governments absolutely have to take a lead, and I agree with many of the points that we made about the things that the UK government needs to take. But my message to all authorities, but also citizens in Wales, is that their first question should not be what is somebody else doing about this problem, but what is the contribution that I can make or my organisation can make. And then we add all those contributions up in that collective way, and then we come to the maximum that we are able to do together. So we will, in Climate Week in November, we're not going to produce a near finished consultation document. We're going to have a whole series of events to construct the consultation document with NGOs, with citizens groups and so on. So we try and get that widespread buy-in into the actions we will all have to be willing to take to address climate change. Secondly, we try and use our own powers where able to. We have a policy of no extraction of fossil fuels. In Wales, our marine plan published last year means not only will we not extract fossil fuels in the marine environment, but we will not support any onshore developments that would help the extraction of fossil fuels in marine. And we're in some interesting discussions with our farming community about support for farming after the Common Agricultural Policy, where we will be willing to fund actions that contribute to the public good. If it's public money, then the public have a right to have a return on that, and farmers will have to do new and different things in future if they are to be supported by the Welsh Government, and it will be in this area. And then finally, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, one of its 6 goals is that we should be a globally responsible Wales. So we will want to continue to take the modest actions we are able to work with partners elsewhere. For a decade, every child that is born in Wales, we plant a tree in Wales, and we plant a tree with partners in Uganda as well. And last year we planted the 10 millionth tree that Wales has sponsored and paid for with our partners in Uganda, and there is a landmass twice the size of Wales in Uganda, which has been planted as part of that Wales for Africa, Wales with Africa programme. So those are the 3 things: distributed leadership, using our own powers, working with others in a globally responsible way to make the contribution we want to make to this agenda.
And thank you for that, Mark. And I think we'll pick up some of those points a bit more. And I'm now going to come to Duncan Webb. And New Zealand has a very well-respected Prime Minister there who's done an amazing job in a number of different areas. And so, and also probably has challenges around agriculture as well, I think, that Mark has pointed out. And there are some similarities, I think, in terms of some of the farming that takes place. But anyway, Duncan, can you give a perspective from New Zealand?
Look, yeah, I'll give it a go. You're right, there are some similarities. And I guess farming is obviously our biggest issue. And in terms of those political tensions that go on and the policy challenges, bringing farmers within our emissions trading scheme is proving a challenge. And the current solution to that is essentially to give a high degree of autonomy to farmers to, over the next couple of years, determine how best to measure on-farm emissions. So that's a big leap forward. And there is a bit of a sort of Damocles hanging over them. We recently passed a Zero Carbon Act and an emissions trading scheme, which is a robust, I hope, cap and trade scheme that actually will drive emissions down over time with real hard targets that the government's obliged to meet. And the question is how we're bringing those farmers into that. So they've got a couple of years, and if they don't come up with an adequate scheme, they'll be pulled in. By compulsion. I guess the other couple of things I'd point out, and I was interested to hear the future of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We've adopted perhaps a similar approach in New Zealand, and I just want to touch on it. It's this wellbeing budget, the idea that all of our financial decisions are made not against simply not just against a financial measure, but also against a whole lot of other measures, including social well-being, cultural well-being, and also environmental well-being. So when I heard, I think it was Karen talk about bringing Treasury into it, absolutely Treasury now has to analyse any decision it takes across a wide range of factors. And I think one of the things that perhaps is both doing and is a symptom of is the fact that questions like climate change are slowly becoming embedded into our consciousness, so that there's no longer the kind of outrage almost when decisions are made which are overtly directed at mitigating climate change. But it's more of a, well, of course, that was inevitable and so on. So even large industry, and obviously the dairy industry is one of the larger ones that also consumes a lot of coal for drying milk. They probably, the larger operator is probably ahead of regulation in converting to biomass fuels there, simply because they can see it coming. They can see the inevitability of it. And lastly, look, in terms of COVID response, I see a massive challenge in there. I'm sure there's a tension in New Zealand that's the same around the world in terms of, is it the economy, or is it, is it sticking to the original plan in terms of climate change? As you said, I do have a fantastic leader. We're very determined to stick to the plan and kind of stop that counter narrative, which is I don't think is getting a lot of traction, but it's certainly there. So look, there's just some observations really about where we are in New Zealand and what the current issues are. Different, but in some ways the same.
So thank you for that. And just, we're going to start bringing in some questions now from the audience. And I'm going to get Mark before he has to leave at past. One of the questions for some people to be thinking of, and we'll come to, is around what support can the Labour Party do to support councils to develop ambitious climate action plans? And as we've seen, lots of declared climate emergencies. There's been leadership by certain mayors and councils. How do we support them? And I guess Mark is not only First Minister of Wales, but there are councils within Wales as well. And so how does the Welsh Government work with the councils, but equally, how does it work in New Zealand? And Darren has been, has a sort of a more UK perspective on things. But I want to sort of open out, because another question, that was from Kevin Freer, who asked that question about Labour councils. Richard Annandale, I think, is asking around sort of a leadership point about engagement. That we need the Conservative government. Unfortunately, we've got a Conservative government at the moment, UK government, obviously not in Wales, which is led by Labour, but we need to get them to buy into this and lead. But equally, I suppose, a wider point, and I'd like to just, with people to reflect on this, when I was at the COP last year, there seemed to be a disconnect between citizen action and saying action is now. We need it, and then a disconnect between some political leaders that were saying, let's not rock the boat, we're all doing enough, it's all fine, etc. And so how do we get consent for action so we can build on that citizen action that we've seen and really move that? What's the conversations, the climate conversations that we need to have to really win to win the biggest course of action? Quite a broad question, I guess, but I was trying to bring in points from others. So Mark, can I just come to you actually first on that, on sort of consent in councils, if I put it that way?
Yeah, Jake, thank you. Well, as far as councils are concerned, we're very lucky in Wales. The majority of our councils are run by Labour colleagues. But the basic approach we take is a social partnership model. We have a social partnership council. It meets every 2 weeks now during the coronavirus crisis. It has local authorities absolutely at the heart of that, alongside other partners. I always try and say a social partnership model is not a cozy model. It's not, we don't just sit around the table holding hands or whatever. For social partnership to work, it has to be a challenging model. It has to be the place where difficult decisions are rehearsed, where challenging conversations take place, but with a sense of us all wanting to find some solutions together. And the social partnership model has stood us in very good stead here in Wales through the decade of austerity, through coronavirus. If we're returned in May of next year, we will put a social partnership act on the statute book here in Wales to give those arrangements the force of law underneath them, so that they are robust enough to be able to cope with the very significant challenges immediately and beyond. In citizen action, well, it was always one of the big claims for devolution, that it would bring people closer to the people who made decisions for them. And in normal times, if you're walking through our Senedd building, going to a hearing of the Senedd or a committee or something, then you're just walking through an open space where any citizen of Wales could be there. And people can just come up and ask you anything they like as you're doing it. So I think that sense of, the gap between decision makers and individuals and groups has been genuinely eroded by devolution. I've just come back into the office now from being out at a butterfly garden, right in the heart of the most urban part of Wales, put there by a group of environmental organisations with some help from the Welsh Government. So it's just being willing to have those conversations. I meet with Extinction Rebellion. They met again last week with ministerial colleagues of mine. We don't agree on everything, but just being willing to have the conversation and to demonstrate that you are, not just interested in listening, but interested in a dialogue where you engage with each other on some of these really challenging issues is, I think, the way to give confidence to people that they've got a government that is prepared to have the voice of citizens there at the heart of what you do, alongside everything else you have to try and take into account.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. And I want to bring in Rebecca, and I'm conscious that Mark has got to leave in 3 minutes. We've had one other question, and so I'll just bring that very briefly, and then we'll go back to that point, which is, I touched on it as well. Wales has famously has a sheep farming industry. New Zealand does too. What is there anything on the agricultural side, which is one of the most challenging parts of to do on climate change, Mark, that you're helping to do in Wales, or can do in Wales?
Yeah, look, it is a real challenge because farming is a bigger part of our economy than any other part of the United Kingdom. And it's a sector that has got very used to the way in which the subsidy regime has operated now over many years, and we have to change that. So, we are having some very challenging conversations with the sector about the level, for example, of agricultural pollution in Wales, which is at an unacceptable level, where we will regulate to make it, obligatory on the sector to take certain actions, and then to be clear with the sector that as we go into a post-CAP world, there will be a menu of things which farmers will be able to do, which will draw down public money. But it will not be producing goods that you cannot sell, and it will not be taking short-term measures that damage the long-term prospects of the industry and of Wales as a whole. So that menu will include all the sort of things that you would expect in terms of air quality, water quality, stewardship of the land, tree planting, a long list of contributions which can come from that sector, where the public in Wales will be prepared to continue to support them. But it will be a different bargain, and active farmers and progressive farmers in Wales, I think, are keen to embrace it. As in any industry, there are some who've grown up in different times and where the challenge of change will be more difficult.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. And Rebecca, you've done lots of work in, I think, citizens' engagement as well, and I'll come to Darren in a sec on that. You wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, so that we're not all entirely in violent agreement, I just wanted to unpack a little bit what Mark said about public consent, because his answer to that question was mostly around sort of openness and transparency, which is of course really vital. But I think it's a different job to that, actually. Where we see the public are now on climate is actually that they are more concerned and more willing to take action than politicians tend to think. That's what my research has shown very strongly. But we still don't have that buy-in to the climate agenda that we need. So, there's not high enough levels of engagement yet. And the secret here is actually to link up that leadership role that politicians have with public engagement. So all policies, from all climate policies, need to think about whether and how they engage citizens. All policies need to be about building that trust between citizen and state, and seeing this as a joint initiative. So I think when it comes to public engagement, the danger is that it becomes a sort of, woolly, fuzzy, nice feeling thing. Whereas to my mind, it needs to be absolutely front and center of any climate strategy. And to a certain extent, that is how we will start to challenge the dominance of high carbon players in the economy, is by opening up the political process much more to citizens. And that's what things like the Climate Assembly have tried to do. And I think that absolutely needs to be the spirit of what we do now. Okay,
that's great. And I want to bring in Darren, because I think the Bay Select Committee was one of the sponsor committees of that UK Citizens Assembly, then I wanted to bring in Duncan and then Karen. Duncan around the New Zealand perspective on how they've done that. So Darren.
Yeah, so the Base Committee was the lead commissioner along with 5 other select committees for the Citizens Assembly report, which is the first time in the UK we've done a full nationwide Citizens Assembly, and it was on how do we reach our net zero target by 2050. And actually it kind of links through to all the different questions you've asked, because the Citizens Assembly said that the British people expect the government to get on with this on a cross-party basis in partnership with the public and with fairness flowing through all of its policy decisions. But it also gave such a lot of detail about people's preference around policy decisions that, in my view, and I said this on the floor of the House when I commended the report to it, that it should give ministers the confidence to get on with it and to try to take some of those difficult decisions and say, look, we've gone through this actually in the Citizens Assembly panel. People understand some of these things are difficult, but this is what they want us to do. Linked to that, I wouldn't underestimate Conservative MPs on this issue anymore. There's a lot of new Conservative MPs in their group, and a lot of them are quite young actually. There's 109 new MPs at the last election. The Conservatives kind of equivalent of CIRA is quite big now, and certainly I have a few of their members on my committee, which is of course cross-party, and they expect action from the government too. So for us on the Labour side, I think it would be remiss of us to just assume that the Tories don't care about environmental policy anymore, because I actually think there's a lot of them that do, and so we've got to remain competitive in this space. And the last bit I would say, which links back to the question on councils, is that whilst I wouldn't underestimate the Tories on this, I would underestimate their ability to deliver, because what we've seen so far is they're not very good at delivery. And I think that's probably because, and this is my personal view, not the view of the committee, you've seen this kind of centralisation of power into Downing Street, with an approach to delivery that is about political advisors and consultancies, not the civil service or devolving of power. And I think you have to devolve power, as the Citizens Assembly wants us to do, to local councils and regions, because different policies will look different in different parts of the country. And if the government doesn't empower the regions and nations of the country to get on with this within a national framework, then I think that they won't hit their targets.
Okay, and then Duncan, I mean, what have been the most difficult decisions that have been taken in New Zealand, or perhaps are coming up in New Zealand that are around the climate program and agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I've touched on the methane emissions, the biogenic methane emissions. That's and so I won't go back there. But the other one is we have a framework of industrial allocation where we recognise that some of our industries are carbon intensive, but if we were to impose a carbon levy on them at the moment, we would simply be importing the same goods from countries which have much worse carbon footprints for the same goods. So what we're doing, there's some real difficulties in essentially the technical stuff, and I guess this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Getting those industrial allocations down is a highly detailed and technical piece of work where lobby groups have a lot of influence, and getting the science right is one thing, just getting the maths right is quite another, and so I guess there's just we can have high policy, but I guess the point at which we are now is one where it's working through exactly how to implement the decisions that have been made. And there's still a lot of scrapping to go on, because you can win the policy battle and lose it in detail. And so I think that's something to always hold in mind, that you've still got to get that implementation absolutely right, and a small mistake can have very significant long-term consequences, and that's really the challenge that we've got ahead of us now in emissions trading, in industrial allocation, in biogenic methane, and a whole lot of other stuff. So it's actually getting the detail right.
But on the consent, I mean, there's quite a lot of technical, and you used the word technical in what you've been saying, building that consent, and how are you reaching out?
Yeah, look, we're lucky in New Zealand. We're a much smaller jurisdiction than the UK and England, obviously. And so the select committee that I chair the Environment Select Committee that did this work, actually travelled around the country and heard thousands of submitters. And so I here in Christchurch, in my constituency, I sat in the public library with my committee in one of their rooms and had members of the public come and let their views be known. Now, it's not quite a citizens' assembly, I grant you that, and obviously submitters to select committees are skewed. They're a little unrepresentative sometimes, but nevertheless, the immediacy of it was quite apparent, and it did mean that, you know, wherever you were in the country, you could pretty much get on a bus and go and have your views known. And I must say, the media had a really important part to play as well. They are pretty responsible around the stuff in New Zealand anyway, and report it. The media see it as a critical issue, and so in terms of getting public buy-in and consent, as you say, all of that went on. And of course, even before the legislation got to Parliament, the Ministry for the Environment had done considerable engagement with particular stakeholders around industries and so on. So it's a huge process, but I think given the size of our jurisdiction, a little easier than perhaps it would be in the UK jurisdictions.
Okay, and then Karen, have you got anything to add on that as well? I know there's been some outreach work from the Net Zero Committee, APPG, I mean. Karen, you're mute.
Never can get it all right. A couple of things to build on what Duncan was saying. One of the things we've concluded is that there are significant technical uncertainties. So hydrogen and CCS and how we're going to decarbonize heating and heavy transport and aviation. There's a lot of technological uncertainties, but we cannot wait to get that right and then make decisions from there. We have to do it now. We have to go ahead now. We have to do CCS now. We have to try to move hydrogen from blue to green. We have to start doing this all right now. We can't wait. And I think that's kind of building on the complexity that Duncan was talking about and all the challenges. And from the behavior change perspective, and this also builds a little bit on what Duncan is saying, we have a challenge that's multi-pronged. We have to change the behavior of our media. We have to change the behavior of our corporations, our companies, and we have to change behavior of us, the citizens, and how we're using our energy and how we're engaging with it. And until we can start to really put some effort behind that, we're going to challenge. I mean, we're never going to get near net zero done without delivering this on the local level. So building on what Darren said, all of this stuff that's centralized policy making from Westminster, until we can start letting some of that go and letting the regions and the localities start to build their answers and the solutions, because its solution is not offshore wind, floating turbines, solar. It's not the same solution for every place. EVs are not the solution. In fact, when we talk about solutions of transport, a lot of MPs I talk to and others say EVs, but that's not the solution. The solution is actually modal shift, right? So we have a whole behavior change challenge that we have to meet. And frankly, because we've had such inconsistent policy, we have lost business in many, many ways. So the businesses that we deal with on a regular basis that are there to deal with delivering energy efficiency, their boards are telling them, don't invest in the UK right now. It's just a really politically volatile time. So we've seen from feed-in tariffs to the Green New Deal, from all kinds of failures of policy that have now, we've lost confidence across the board. So we have quite a task ahead to build that confidence up and to win media over. We've had, I'm sure, I was just thinking about this the other day, September, I have no doubt September will be breaking more records around climate. And every month we see this, and yet it gets reported in the press, oh, look, another hot day, we're all going to the beach. It's night. We need to start talking about what's happening on a global basis. Okay,
and thank you for that, Karen. I think that, I mean, a very interesting, I think, question has been posed, which is this COP, what's the approach of this COP, and will it be different? You know, we've had the usual suspects, as it's been called in the question, that turn up. I sort of alluded to this earlier in terms of, you know, you have all the corporates, you have these sponsored things, you have your country places. If no one's been to the COP, you sort of have all these, it's like a sort of massive Labour Party conference with all these different debates going on all simultaneously. Then there's a sort of green zone, which is more grassroots activism. And then you've got outside and people who can't get a ticket to either of those two things. You know, we're having it here in the UK. is it, is it going to be different? What is it? We've had COVID, we've had, all these record temperatures. Is it going to be different? And I suppose I'm asking more complicated questions, and so sorry about this, is what is the role for different groups? And we've had another question, which I'm going to take with this one, which is, for example, faith groups. It's from the Quakers, and said, what can they do? What's faith groups' role? And so at COP, we get a lot of organisations that want to put the voice forward, that want to put citizen pressure. What should they be doing? And is it going to be different, or how's it going to be different, or the same at COP? I was going to maybe come to Duncan again on that, and I'll come then back to our side of the world.
Oh, you look, I don't know. I mean, obviously New Zealand's in some ways in a lucky position, because it can say just about whatever it wants, and it sometimes does. It does tend to get listened to a little bit as well. I'm a bit I really don't think we in New Zealand can be smug at all. In my sense is that we're not moving nearly as fast as we should. And certainly some of the things Karen pointed out, absolutely, we're lagging behind, and we've got some massive challenges ahead of us. In terms of how to approach COP, I haven't been, so I'm probably not the best person to respond to that. Perhaps I should come this time. It could be a challenge. But I do think that there is a place for small states, because there's always one of the most difficult challenges is the sense of futility that we have to overcome. That if we do it, no one else will. And even if all of the developed nations do, the less developed nations are, not in a position to keep up. And so that international consensus and also assistance, I think, is probably where we need to look there, because we simply can't solve our own problems without recognizing that there's countries who are nowhere near as equipped as we are to address these things as well. And in New Zealand, I mean, we look to the Pacific, and we know we've got a huge amount of work to do with our Pacific neighbours, in both in assisting them in their climate change mitigation challenge, but adaptation is a massive challenge on the low-lying Pacific Islands as well, as you would know. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Rebecca, before I come to Darren, you've been working this field for a long time. How, is it going to be different at this COP? What are the key things?
I think if I pretended to know the answer to that, no one. I mean, I think it's so unpredictable at the moment. It's so volatile. We're looking at COVID. We're looking at, obviously, at the US election. But I think you're absolutely right to pair this with the question about Grace's question about the role of faith groups, because I think, COP26 is an expert process, but it is also, the moment when the effects of outside groups can really be felt. And whatever your view on the tactics of Extinction Rebellion, what we've seen over the last 2 years is that protest works. And protest works, but also that kind of careful inside track work, like I used to do as director of Green Alliance, that is really effective as well. So I think in the lead up to COP, we really need to think about how that sort of inside track and outside protest works together to get maximum profile and also maximum outcomes from COP26. And I mean, if I did have a magic wand, what I would really like to see is a challenge to the sort of institutionalized ambiguity that there is both within the COP process and actually within UK politics. So, within COP, within the COP process, you see people, agreeing to ambitious targets, but then having a really powerful lobby around, the lobby around the fossil fuel producers in terms of countries and companies. In the UK, we see that ambiguity. We have, ambitious climate targets, and yet just down the road from me, local councillors from all parties, I should say, including Labour, want to consent a new coal mine. That level of ambiguity is absolutely embedded in our system at the moment, and we've just got to call time on that, I think. We've got to be absolutely upfront about the climate challenge and the opportunities, and the need and the opportunities about transitioning away from this high carbon economy that we're stuck in.
Thanks for that. And I think And just to sort of ask Darren again, I mean, you've got a position where you chair a select committee, you're looking at the COP and net zero pathway, you have a public voice, your committee does, and you can grill people on this process. So I think some of the questions we've just heard, and those recent questions and points, perhaps there's a way to open this up and get, putting you on the spot here, I guess, of opening this up to get more of these voices, the faith group's point, that was made, but equally, I suppose, we as the Labour Party and Sarah, we've got a thing as a question here about how we can work with other groups too. So we will try and, our limited resources, open this up as well and try and get the biggest debate to reshape or shape the Labour response. But what do you think, and how can you do this as select committee chairing, getting these voices heard much more loudly and, to borrow a phrase, tell the truth?
Yeah, well, you're right, Jay. The select committees don't just hold ministers to account, but they act as an important channel for stakeholders to engage in Parliament. And we had some early conversations as well with our equivalent committees in the Scottish Parliament, in the Synod and in Northern Ireland, and that we're hoping to do something at that level, as well as perhaps through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, through the Commonwealth. But those are just early stage conversations. I think in terms of how COP is going to change, of course, I mean, I don't believe that by next December we're just going to get back to business as usual and everyone's going to fly into Glasgow. I mean, I don't see it. So I think we need to provide some leadership on the format that we take in terms of engaging on this as well. And some people will need to fly in, I'm sure, but actually one of the things that I found, especially in the international work I do, is that it's been much easier to engage with people and get in people's diaries over Zoom, right? And you can still have credible conversations about that. And I just wonder whether COP has always seemed a little bit closed, maybe, dare I say, elitist. Only certain people get tickets. You kind of see what's happening on the news. There's so many other people engaged in this topic that don't normally get invited, probably for legitimate reasons around capacity and space and security and stuff. But actually now, if we've got this hybrid model and this digital way of engagement, why can't we open that up? Why can't Britain show how you can engage lots of different people in different parts of the world and make sure their voice is funneled up through this process into COP itself? And I think there's a big innovation opportunity there for the British government, which no doubt is something we'll consider when we start our work on this as a committee in November. And I'm more than happy to help as well, Jake, if you want to do something through CIRA to engage Labour Party members on this.
Oh, sorry, Karen.
Sorry, I was just going to say that when you talk to Cabinet Office, they very much talk about this as being a people's COP. They try to tell us that they're going to have this open up and it's going to be an engagement to build on all the work around the citizens' assemblies. And so I guess it's for us, in my role with the Net Zero APPG, we saw, I think, over 170 MPs were really, cross-party MPs were behind the effort around net zero legislation last year. Now I'm going to say I probably work with the same 25 MPs all the time, so I'd love to see where the rest of those 150 MPs are on a daily basis, but that's up to us to do that and to hold government to account for this is going to be a people's COP. And I think it's interesting, Darren, how we can use this. We're all getting better at Zoom. When we all started this, 6 months ago, it was pretty awkward, but people are getting better at it. We're getting more comfortable with using this platform. And I absolutely, in order for us to do the things we need to do to get to net zero, to change our lifestyles, flying and participating in these kind of in-person activities, sometimes it's not necessary. Now, I'm a real people person. I miss seeing everybody, but I'm going to say there's going to be a time and place for it. And for us to be thinking about it, it's hard to imagine next year 30,000 people from all over the world are going to fly into Glasgow. I mean, I think that's a very, very hard thing to consider. So let's do what we can to hold government and make this the people's COP.
Indeed, and I think that is a really good point. And I suppose we're just drawing to a close here, and I'm going to go round for sort of very final thoughts with my final question to everyone. But I do think it's worth, as Darren said as well, really us considering that opening up and how we do that, getting all those voices. Because a worry I have is that the voices we've heard this year and before are climate skeptic voices of the Bolsonaros, of the Trumps, of the demagogues, the autocrats, and in league with fossil fuel companies that are pursuing agendas to support their industries. And I think this is a real danger that we have in the lead up now and how we address that to COP. And I suppose that's my final question to each of you is, do you think we will be successful in getting agreements that we need at this COP? And is it the last chance saloon really for us to do that? So Rebecca, I think I'll start with you on that. Sorry to put you on that.
Okay. Will we be successful? I mean, you know, having worked on climate for as long as I have, you just you know, you have to say yes. We need to be successful, and therefore we will come out of COP with something workable. Are we in the last chance, Celine? I mean, you know, I think because we're starting to feel the effects of climate change, we're now seeing a rise in people who feel, you know, very anxious about it, who feel very doom laden about it. And the problem with that is that, you know, while I share the absolute concern about the science, it becomes quite fatalistic. And, you know, my own approach to this from a personal capacity is that, you know, we need to firstly tell it as it is, be very upfront about the scale of the challenge, but secondly, to be able to keep working with anyone who wants to work with us, to keep working on the people who are not sort of who are not who are neither deniers nor crusaders, but those in between, and to be you know, absolutely upfront about the opportunities as well as the challenges of this agenda. So I think it is kind of going into COP with that right sort of mindset, and if we do that, we have the biggest chance of success, I think.
Okay, Duncan, same thing.
Yeah, look, well, when we think about what's ahead of us and what failure might look like, success really is the only option, isn't it? And I guess the point I would make is really similar to Rebecca's, which is we are actually seeing some very significant consequences of climate change now. And, you know, I know it's the same in your part of the world, but, you know, the fires in Australia are a good example. Coastal inundation is a real problem in New Zealand. And we're really pushing local bodies to make homeowners know of the risks associated with climate change, particularly in low-lying areas. And that kind of wider education is actually part of the narrative, which then gives us the mandate to go and make the agreements we need to make. Because until people actually think it will impact my life, not just because I have to change my way of getting to work, but because I will have to move house because it's going to be underwater soon. That is the kind of discussions we need to be having. And certainly in New Zealand, that there are enough people affected by that in enough major urban areas that we're making real progress.
Okay, thank you. Karen?
Well, I must say I'm a bit like Rebecca. You know, when you're doing this work, you just have to believe. You've got to stay positive. That's what we're doing. You know, it's very hard to tell. We're up against some of the most difficult challenges that we face. The COP may not be in the format that it has traditionally been, but I'm thinking with all of the changes that we're seeing in all of our backyards on climate change happening right now, with the citizens and the public engagement around this, the time is really ripe. To be frank, I'm a little worried about government. You know, we would, if it wasn't for COVID, we'd be a couple months away from the COP, right? And where are we? You know, they kind of went, oh, COVID, we better just, you know, we have to move everything back. Let's put the brakes on. We'll re-announce everything. We'll re-engage with you. And I'm worried about that. Everybody, IPCC, everybody's saying we've got to do this now. So I stay optimistic. We're going to continue to push for getting the right solutions. We'll be working with MPs and others. But yeah, I'm a bit skeptical, honestly.
Okay, thank you. Slight diversion of the panel, thanks for that. And as we said, the climate clock is still ticking, whereas, you know, COVID didn't stop it. And Darren, your perspective.
Yes, I mean, success or otherwise, you can't not do the work. We've got to get on with it. So you've got to make the best of it. And there's no denying it's going to be difficult. One hopes, of course, that it will be President Biden by the time we get to COP, not President Trump, which will make life much easier for all of us. The one thing I would call out just in closing is, I think there's a really important role for Britain to play in this COP, especially where the government has closed the Department for International Development and moved it into the Foreign Office, because of course The difficulty always in COP negotiations is that wealthy nations tell less wealthy nations they need to pay for things in order to decarbonise. And we're all stretched now because of the COVID pandemic. We've borrowed sums of money that governments would probably never have imagined in the short term. Now, that's why on my committee and the work that I do, I always say that net zero has to be part of the economic recovery. It is one and the same thing. They're not separate things. And in my view, that has to be increasingly linked with international development questions, because when we come to COP, even after COVID, wealthy nations such as ours needs to provide the leadership to say that we can do this in partnership with less wealthy nations, because of course it affects the whole planet. And I think there's a big opportunity there for us.
Well, thank you for that, Darren. And really, I think that encapsulates is that the climate question is the question, and we need a comprehensive answer to it, and it affects every element of our lives. And unfortunately, we don't want greenwashing, because that doesn't help anyone. There's probably been too much of that, I would say, by the government of late, and we've got to really build that task for all of us to tell the truth, to show what we need and the path to COP. Well, thank you. I'd like to say thank you to all the speakers today. I think it's been a really good session. We will take on board some of the points. We'll try to, and thanks Darren for saying we can work with us and others. And there have been questions and points that people want to raise, and for us to do a similar thing ahead, which we will try and do. We have got 3 more events tomorrow, and some of these issues will come up. We've got so Liam Byrne is talking about jobs and how we have the green jobs recovery, and particularly in the West Midlands, he's running as mayoral candidate there. We've got Emily Thornbury talking about trade and with Anna McMorran as well, and all these crucial trade deals that are coming up, and how we deal with that. And then we've got food, which we've seen has been really a big part of the issues during COVID as well, and will be ahead in food security and how we have sustainable food. And it's touched on our conversation here, particularly in vis-a-vis Wales and New Zealand. But please join Sarah, please come to these future events. Thank you very much, and thank you once again for all the people joining, listening, and all of our speakers today. Thank you very much, and keep in touch.